Okay. Dope. So, all right, y'all. So, last thing I want to kind of touch on real quick is GitHub, right? And if you are entering in any kind of professional career in the tech space, you're definitely going to hear about GitHub and you're going to be like, yo, like, why is this important? What is this thing and why is it important, right? So GitHub is a website that you can just navigate to. It's not like a special access or anything. You do have to sign up and create an account, which I recommend that everybody create an account. But essentially, GitHub is a website that holds what's called repositories. And repositories essentially are, think of it like a bucket to hold all of your code, right? So people are using these repositories to hold all of the different code that they're working on over time. So as you can see, GitHub has, it lets you see all of your repositories that you've created, but you can also browse and see the repositories that other folks are working on as well, which is really cool, especially in the developer community, so that you can kind of connect with other developers on projects and see what other folks are working on. It's tools like GitHub that have made open source really popular and able to be done in the way that it's being done in modern times. But yeah, for all of these people and projects you're seeing, everything relates to a repository of code, right? So, from a simple repository, like trying to think of one that I have that's really simple. I'll say simple enough, but any repository kind of consists of different files that are related to your project, right? You could go and see those files, and you can also keep kind of little documentation like references about your particular project. So here's like a little about section. GitHub by default takes whatever README file you might have in your project files, and it shows it down here at the bottom. So when you go to a repo and you see kind of this like big blurb of data and text, this is coming back from the readme.md file that's inside of your repository. So for folks who are looking at first-time projects, that's why in a lot of cases people will add a readme file in their projects in general, so that when they add it somewhere else, or it's very easy for other developers to read. So GitHub does this for all projects, but the most important thing that it does as a bucket of your code for storing your code is it keeps a reference to your code over time. And it does so by storing the commits that you make to this particular bucket of code. So think of it like I started this new repository a while ago called components that was, done for just an educational sense for a project I was working on. And the first time I made this repo, it was empty. There was nothing in there. So the first thing I had to do was add some code or add some files. And GitHub can store both files and folders of other files. So that's just important to know. Added all of that into this particular GitHub repository. And every time I wanted to make changes to this repository and change the files inside of here, or edit some of the files inside of here, GitHub will keep track of that in what's called a commit. So commits are also featured on GitHub, right? And the thing that you need to know that is pretty important about GitHub is that GitHub itself is built off of another tool that is really important to the developer community called Git. So GitHub is actually kind of comprised of two kind of important concepts. The first is Git, the GIT, and then the hub, right? So when you think about a hub of anything, a hub is just like somewhere that has a lot of something, right? Or a place where you can find something else, right? In this case, GitHub is a hub of what we call Git repositories. So the whole idea of a repository that we're featuring here on GitHub and all of that is actually related to another technology called Git, which is what is allowing folks to store the changes to their code over time in a format that is able to be then put onto GitHub. So things get a little bit complicated when you kind of are first learning this, but the important thing to know is that in order to use GitHub, you can just go ahead and make an account and start using GitHub for yourself and storing new code. Here at the top right hand side, you can click this plus icon and add a new repository. And adding a new repository is where you can create a new, basically a new project, for lack of better words, where you might want to store the code. So this is where you'd create that repository or that bucket where you'd be storing things. As soon as you kind of, say like my new repository, right? And so you have the option with GitHub to keep repositories public or private. For the most part, it makes sense to keep it public unless you're working on some super important code that you don't want anybody to see. Like GitHub is a social kind of community. If you want other people to collaborate with you, you can do that both with a public or private repository. But at the end of the day, it's a good look to have some repositories public on your repo so people can see some of the code that you've written. But nobody checking for you like that. You know what I'm saying? It ain't you don't gotta make it stressful where you feel like, oh, I gotta hide all my code. Like it's all good, But essentially, once you name your repository and you create it, here's where you see where this gets connected back to that tool called Git that I was talking to you about before. In order to actually upload the code, right? For the most part, as engineers and developers, we're working with code that's defined on our local computer, right? The computer on our computer inside of some files on our machine is where our code is stored, right? And so typically we will be creating and, adding code from the command line, as you can see here. So using the terminal or using your command prompt in Windows to add the code from your local machine to your GitHub repository, right? GitHub also has some options for doing things by uploading stuff, but for the most part, we always are just using the command line because you're making changes on your computer and you want to update the changes from your computer. The easiest way to do it is by doing it on the command line. And so the way that GitHub kind of works and the way that Git works is say you have a new project and you're kind of trying to start a new project for something, right? So I'll just open up this terminal window and kind of just talk through this real quick. So let's say I'm just going to kind of navigate to a clean location in my computer to save this stuff. And let's say I'm gonna just make a new file. I'm gonna make a new folder for myself and say my awesome project, right? So I'm gonna change into that directory that I just created. So now I'm inside of this, empty folder called my awesome project. So say I made a new project, just made a new folder and I'm about to make a really cool project and I want to push it to be on GitHub at some point. So first thing you do, right, when you're working with anything and starting any project is you're going to need some files in there, right? Currently, I'm just listing the files. There's nothing there, right? If I were to open this folder on my Mac to just show you again, there's nothing there. There's just an empty folder. But as time goes on, say I'm making maybe I'm making a basic website, right? So I might have an index.html file in there. I might have, styles.css file in there. I might have an index.js file in there. And so all three of those files now are created. And if you're not familiar, the touch command is a Linux command that creates files, right? So I just kind of made 3 blank files real quick. And so again, if I opened up my folder now, right? So now I kind of got 3 files. They're empty, right? There's nothing inside of there. I could kind of highlight, let's see, highlight any of them. right? So the index.html is empty. Styles.css, so it's not going to show me that way. That the index.js is also empty, but you can kind of probably assume all of them are really empty. So point is, I have my files, right? And so cool. So this might be the basic start of my project. I'm like, okay, great. I want to now make sure that I can make changes to this and, like, you know, get this to a point where this is my really awesome website and everything's going smooth. Well, how might I go about this in a way that helps me over time as an engineer, right? Well, traditionally, I might open this file, I might open these files or open this project in like my text editor or something, right? And in this case, I'll open it in VS Code. And essentially, right, I have these 3 files and I want to basically make changes to them over time, right? Maybe in my index.html, I'll start writing actual HTML and basically making it so that the basically making it so that the files themselves get changed to be like whatever I really want them to be, right? So for right now, let's just say like I'm gonna make a super simple HTML website and I want to have the files kind of update. Well, traditionally, the way that this might happen is that I might start writing the files and saving the information. But what happens if, like, for instance, something goes wrong and I want to essentially have a I want to essentially go back to an old version, right? So let's say, for instance, I do start this file and you know, kind of just create a new HTML document here, right? And cool, like kind of just set up a really basic blank HTML file. Just make it simple, right? Cool. So this is fine, but you know, say everything's good here, right? I might save this file and that's great. But then let's say, like, you know, later down the line, you know, maybe I mess up and I miss this tag and some now there's some error in my HTML, right? Well, at this point in the code, I'm already a little too far, right? Luckily, like with something like VS Code, you can kind of go back in time, right? But sometimes that's not possible, where I could just Command Z and go back to an old version, right? If I were to actually, like, you know, if I were to actually like get this to a bad pace and then like close this, right? And then try to open it again, right? Oops, my bad. Opening a VS Code one more time. Well, now, you know what I'm saying? Like, okay, the index.html is here. But I can't Command Z the change away. So this document is stuck in the error that it had, right? So at this point, I'm already kind of messed up, right? Luckily, this is simple HTML. I could probably fix it really quickly, but sometimes this isn't the case, right? Sometimes you've already gone too far and you've made a bunch of mistakes and you were like, oh, dang, I wish I could go back to that point in time where I didn't have it messed up and everything was working correctly. And that's why a tool like Git is really important, because with Git, you could be storing snapshots of your code over time and saving it incrementally, so that if ever something went wrong like this and you needed to go back to an old version, you could do that very simply. That's what Git as a tool makes possible. And the way that it does that is it uses some software on your computer to essentially, every time you update your document, and you have the option to store a commit, and the commit basically represents you saying, hey, I'm gonna save this document at this point in time and keep a reference to it, so that over time I can go back to those different versions and take a look at the files if I wanted to, or revert all the changes if I wanted to. and eventually essentially just keep a record of the document changing over time in more supportive ways for if you needed to revert to old versions or not, you know. So that is the use case. This is this exact use case of, oh, something went wrong and I want to go back, but it's not that easy to go back at this point, is the exact reason why people use Git to make their lives so much easier. I'm sure many of y'all probably have had this encounter before, and it's like, dang, like I wish that I had something like this, right? So just real quick, because I don't want to deviate too far and then be like, okay, well, you're talking a lot about this Git stuff, but what's GitHub about, right? So let's just show you kind of why, like how Git and GitHub works, and you know, just how the how you can see the kind of use of both. So clearly, I'm a new developer. I might make a bunch of mistakes. Let me just revert this back to a working version of this, right? Oops. Right, save this, and right, so now I'm at a point where this document actually is great, as like I've done it. If I went live on a server or something, you know, put a little couple texts in there, this would be cool, right? So now might be a great time for me to not only save the file, but also make a commit. So how does Git work, right? Well, Git itself is a command line tool that you can download onto your machine and use in order to basically start to save these the changes to these documents over time. It's a free and open source tool. It's a version control system. So people will ask, what's Git? Like, it's a version control system. And essentially version control does exactly what we were just talking about, keeping track of all the different versions of your code over different time, right? And so you can very easily download Git on your machine for Mac or Windows or on your Linux machine. And everyone's using it, right? This is a tool that big companies use, small developers use. Everybody uses it as a means of keeping track of their code over time. It's a very important tool in the workflow of kind of modern development. But after you download Git on your machine, right, and you go back into like your terminal, you should be able to run the git -- version command to make sure that you have an active version of Git on your machine. And with this on your machine, you have access to a couple of different functions, right? And so here's some of the common functions that you might hear about when someone's talking about Git. Git Clone clones a repository into a new folder. So you can use this function to take an existing Git repository from somewhere else and clone it into your own folder. So it's essentially like copying another repo into your folder. Git init creates a new Git repository. And then there's some other commands that allow you to add files to your Git index, which is basically a record of all of the files that are being tracked. You can move, restore, remove those particular files. And then there's commands for examining the history of all of the changes on your in your files over time. Bisect, diff, grep, log. These will show you kind of some more of the specific ways that Git manages your history of the document changes that you're making. Particularly one that's really important is the Git log, which shows you the commits that you've made over time. But the diff tool definitely is also really important. It shows you changes between commits. So like if you change once and change again, you could see those changes. And then there's a bunch of other more important, but a little bit more advanced Git commands that I'm not going to go into too much right now. We'll definitely talk about it in maybe another moment. But definitely one that is worth talking about is the commit, which allows us to record changes to the repository. And then some of these other ones, which allow for us to push the references and changes that we want to make from place to place. So we're going to try to use some of these Git commands real quick. to kind of connect the dots between our project and the GitHub repository that we're talking about. So here I got this folder for my awesome project. And the first thing that you're going to want to do whenever you're working with a Git repository is you're going to want to initialize it, right? So you need a new Git instance in your folder, right, to essentially allow for yourself to use this workflow. So Git init is going to create a new Git repository in your particular folder. So, this My Awesome Project folder now has a .git folder inside of it. If I show the hidden files, there's a .git folder in there. So one way to check if any project is using Git is to just quickly look through all the files. And if you see a .git folder in there, you know that you're already kind of initialized with Git. Folks who are using certain like other frameworks or libraries, like particularly folks who use different tool chains and packages like Create React App, they do some of this for you, like initializing a .git file for you. But sometimes when you're not working with some of those libraries, you need to do this for yourself. So just know that Git init is the key to starting that. What's cool about GitHub, to just bring this back real quick, is GitHub is where eventually we can store that same Git repository. So now that I just created this and just initialized this here in my local project, now I'm in a position where I can actually take this local repository and push it to GitHub. And there's a couple other steps that you need to do related to like setting up the right permissions on your GitHub account to allow for you to just easily push to your account. And again, I won't go into that right now. I'll probably link it into a different video, but essentially what's cool about GitHub is it kind of walks you through the steps of both if you were trying to create a new repository or if you were trying to push one that's existing from the command line. And I would say that one of the things that's really kind of frustrating, at least for me, when it comes to like using Git in this sense, is that sometimes you're doing something in between these two things, right? Like you're not necessarily creating a new repository on a command line and using all these commands that they're using. You might be having, like in our case, we have a couple files already defined, right? And we just made a new repository. So we needed to create a new one and then push it. So there's a couple like confusing things about how these kind of instructions go. But I'll show you kind of, if you're in a case of like me, like, hey, I made some files. I know I need to initialize Git in it. Okay, what do I got to do next, right? So first thing you do is add that Git init. That's going to add the .git folder in there for you. And then the second thing you need to do is you need to use that add command to add all of the files that you want to store in the Git history and index. So Git add itself is a particularly important command to know. It's what lets you add files to your history that you're going to keep a record of in Git. And so you can add specific files, like, you could type the name of each file and you could run this command git add multiple times. But a shortcut to add all of the files is just to say git add space and then dot, which says add all the files in this current folder, right? So git add dot is going to take, okay, cool. I'm going to take all of these different files inside of here and add it to my history. And so one other command that is really important to use in Git often is the Git Status Command, which shows the working tree status. So the working tree basically is kind of just a record of all of the files and things you're changing history-wise over time. So now that I've added these files, I can actually run this Git Status command and it'll show me a nice little print log message of like, hey, what branch am I on? No commits yet, changes to be committed. And it'll show you the new files that we just added to be recorded, right? So if you kind of look, and this is kind of what I'm trying to get at, like if you were to like try to follow the GitHub instructions, it's like, oh, like echo this and then git init and then git add that, right? They're assuming you have no files at all and you're just gonna do this, you're gonna follow this instructions. But clearly, some of this is what we just did. Git init, we did git add, but we didn't add a README. We added all the files that we had previously. But the next step we need to do is we need to make a commit. We need to commit our code, right? And so a commit is exactly what we were talking about, connects Git and GitHub together, right? On GitHub, we're going to be able to see all of those commits over time, but first we need to make them, right? And so to make the commit in the local files that we're talking about, I can do git commit, and the git commit command is what records the changes to the repository. So first you add the files that you want to change or that have changed. Then you can commit them and say, okay, record these changes. So this is essentially like that super save of like, okay, save, take a snapshot right now of all these files, right? So I say git commit. The commit gives you the option to pass an additional message. So a message for the commit to like kind of keep basically it's like save this, but also give it a kind of message so that you can easily go back to this moment in time. So it's really good to start writing helpful messages here, like just writing something like, you know, test might not be helpful, right? Because you're like, okay, well, if you're trying to go back to a version of the code, you're going to want to know what that test meant or something, right? So because this is my first commit, this is like this is commit number one, right? First commit makes sense, right? This is a message that if I saw this, I'm gonna say, okay, this is the first commit. This is the one that I want to go to because this is where everything began, right? But over time, you know, you're gonna want to put helpful messages in here that remind you of what's going on in the code at that particular moment in time, right? And especially if you're working on a team, that's really important, and people really look at that kind of stuff as a sign of your maturity as a developer. But anyway, make this commit, right? So I added the files, I made this commit, and it says, okay, cool, first commit, 3 files changed, 5 insertions. It created a reference to all those 3 files. If I did a git status one more time, it shows on branch master, nothing to commit, working tree clean. Okay, so cool. So I made this first commit, and you can use Git just like that on your local machine, making the changes to the file. So clearly I made that first commit, and every time I might want to change something. So let's say, for just a quick example, okay, like maybe instead of changing the HTML again, maybe instead of changing the HTML, I change this index.js to, you know, put a console log in here and just put like a hello world or something, right? So now my JS file is different. So I saved this, and then inside of the actual project file, right? If I do git status again, we're gonna see some interesting stuff. It's gonna say, hey, you've modified this file that you had before, and I've been watching. I'm watching this file now, so I'm seeing that it's modified. And it's like, oh, well, do you want to add this file to be changed to be like, you know, do you want to add this file to update what will be committed on it? And most times it's like, yeah, because, hey, you know, you're making changes. And let's say now I'm like, oh, this is a good point for me to make another save, right? So same thing happens. I say git add. Because only one file is being updated, I could just say index.js here and just kind of reference this particular file itself. But another good shortcut to know about Git is if you say git add asterisk, it's going to add whatever files were actually modified. You could also do the git add dot again to add all the files. It really is up to you at that point. But sometimes I just like to do things in a shortcut way because I might have multiple files that are modified, right? So anyway, doing that, if I do git status again, it shows, okay, you've added this modified file to be committed. I can make a new commit, same way, git commit -m, and now I might say added hello world to JS file, right? So again, have that commit and all my files are changed. So last thing I'll show you real quick is you can take a look at all of your commits that you've made over time by doing the git log command. and it'll print out all of the commits locally that you've made in your repository. So again, all this is happening locally. This is all just on my local computer. So now it begs the question, why would GitHub be important? Well, what happens if something goes wrong with my local computer, right? I might want to have all of this same stuff, all these files and changes and all of this stuff stored somewhere else that can keep a record of it so that I don't ever have to get, like I don't have to worry, right? Because it's stored in the cloud, it's stored somewhere else. I can always pull it back down. That's what GitHub now allows us to do. We have a Git repository, we have some changes and files and all of that made. So the next thing I might want to do is have these files be represented on GitHub, right? So GitHub has a kind of interesting flow now where you might see a difference between people using branch name main and branches name master. I believe that they were trying to change this from being called master to get rid of that whole concept of master slave in the development community. So they switched it to main. So you might see people saying branch main, branch master. Technically, it means the same thing, but they're trying to be more thoughtful with their language, which I appreciate. But at the same time, just want to let y'all know so y'all understand what the difference is. This line here is basically going to say, hey, change the name of the main branch on your repo from whatever it is to main. So GitHub is suggesting you do this just to make it consistent on their platform. So we'll go ahead and do this. So this just makes it so now instead of it saying that I'm on branch master, it's saying I'm on branch main, but everything locally is still the same as it was, right? So the last two things I need to do to connect this to GitHub is I need to add, basically add a reference to this external repository that I created on GitHub. Remember, that was step number one we did, was make this new repository here. So this line is basically saying, take this remote repository and connect it to my local repository in a terminal. So I can take this drawn, add it here, and it essentially is going to add a new alias to a location to that file location, and it's calling it origin, right? And so lastly, now that I have this reference connected here, I can actually push the changes that I have or the repo that I have locally to this new location that I just connected. And that is what this command does. Git push pushes the references that are here locally to that place called origin, to a new branch there called main, which is might be a little confusing at first if you're first getting started with Git. But essentially what this is doing is saying, hey, push all this local repository stuff to my GitHub repository that I made, and make sure that the branch that it pushes it to is called main. So that's what this line is doing. So pushing that, you should see it say some things about writing the objects, and then it says, hey, we push this to this new branch for you on your repository. So when you refresh, I got all my files from the project. I have both of the commits that I already made, right? And if I wanted to and make other changes, my repository is still here on my local computer, so I can make as many changes as I want and continue to make changes, and over time, right, see that those changes are modifying my files. I can add those changes, and then I can commit the new change also, editing the JS file with test comment, right? I can add those, to commit them, and then eventually push those things also to GitHub, right? And by doing that, it's going to increase which commits are stored here, and all of that history is going to be contained. So I can always choose, if I want to go back to a version where all my files are different, right? So if I go back to this particular version, which has this unique hash, and it's my first commit version, clearly the files here are different, right? There's this index.html, but the JS is empty, right? But if I go back to a different commit on the same repository, like if I go back, I just want to go back, but I'm sorry, I don't want to take this to do that long. If I go back to the like main repository, right? I can do that for any of those commits and just kind of make sure I can go back to these versions over time. And that's what makes Git important and why GitHub is also important. It's just the fact that it lets you store your code in that way and create this history that you can really quickly use to kind of keep track of your code over time and make these changes that are able to be stored both on your local machine with Git, but also somewhere on the cloud using GitHub, right? And there's a number of different websites that do similar things as GitHub. It's not the only website that does this, but it's a very popular website and a very simple one to use. And that's why people will always mention it, like, hey, you should use GitHub because it's just an easy website to use. And this is how we as developers can keep records of our code, which is helpful for things like portfolios, but it's also helpful for projects and work things that you're doing. So it's a really important resource to have awareness of. And so I hope this is helpful in seeing why it's useful. We got started with like doing a little basic stuff here in the command line. But there's definitely more advanced things in GitHub that we'll talk about over time, but just wanted to kind of give you that precursor so you kind of got the vibe. So appreciate y'all and take care.